System riding to the core. Yeah. Reppin' inner city left.
TMK for Inner City Left. I am here with the co-founders of Inner City Left, geopolitical expert Amoja Lil Tanky Sumler and Keita DeMuscle. What is up, y'all? How are you doing today?
Ooh, man, I'm good. You know, it rained a little bit. It ain't been this crazy summer heat thing, and I'm alive.
Try to find joy where it can be found.
20 Olympic Games. You know, I'm missing most of that. That's great.
Yeah, the Olympic game that I saw was the dude who got the Israeli flag. Did you see that? Snatched it up and then slid out. Man, you got to get him the gold medal. What I, as you see, I always put the title in here just to prime everyone for what we're going to talk about today. And, this is something that I've been wanting to talk about. And I think that it's important. One of the first videos I did on here is America modern? My answer was no. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about that today. The crumbling infrastructure, both the physical and social infrastructure of the United States, as people who are living in it, who are true Americans, like us. So I wanted to start here. And again, feel free to jump in and add where you guys want to add. This happened this week. I'm going to just keep it up to date, but it's going to go to my broader point. The California governor, oh my God, Instagram is doing this thing.
Gavin fucking Newsom.
Yeah, some people think he could be a vice president or something like that, a vice presidential candidate, even though nobody voted for him. But anyway, California Governor Gavin Newsom has issued an executive order for the removal of homeless encampments in the state. I don't know if you know this. There are over 15 million vacant homes in the United States. And it just goes to show again, like we have this conversation, homelessness is so rampant. And maybe it's because we're in a major city and we're able to see this. But there are 700,000 homeless people in the United States. Many would call that a conservative number, as I would. Not to mention the 350,000 people that don't have a home but are able to sleep at a shelter every night, or 350,000 people do sleep at a homeless shelter. Not even saying that those are the same 350,000 every night. You often go to a homeless shelter and you're not able to get in. We have seen over and over again that homelessness is something that is not as prevalent in the rest of the world, including places like China, the bad country, where homelessness is basically eradicated. And I often, travel around the city. People are asleep in, they're having their camps and stuff like that inside of convenience stores. It's so hot outside. People ask you just for a bag of ice so they can go to sleep, because the extremes of the weather, which is obviously something we can talk about as well, being perpetuated and furthered by the United States military, which is the biggest polluter in the world by far. We have the heat advisories. It was, it was hotter here than it was in Texas. And these extreme weather events continue to happen. And the most vulnerable people, people who are houseless, or we haven't even talked about underhoused people. People should be able to have their own rooms and things like that. Maybe y'all can attest to what it is to grow up, when you have several siblings and everyone's stuck in there. You got aunts and uncles and cousins, and not in the good way. Not like you have a big home with 10 rooms. It's a three or four room family home, and you have 6-7 people, sleeping there, or even more, because rents are through the roof. And we'll talk a little bit about that more. But the homeless crisis to me is the thing that people outside of the United States are blown away by when they come here and they see tents. We were here in, the nation's capital, people in tents, encampments, because there is nowhere else to go. And you see in California, which is supposed to be this blue state, right? You're supposed to see Gavin Newsom as this um, bastion of liberalism, and a person on the blue side that we could trust, because they're pro LGBT and all these other things. But here we are eradicating homeless encampments in California. Probably Skid Row is the most famous of the places for people who are houseless. Um, that's just that was my first thing, and I just wanted to see if y'all could react to that.
I have a couple of thoughts. My first thought is it goes to how I was thinking about when Tucker Carlson did the interview with Putin, and Putin's able to talk about the hundreds of years of Russian legacy and heritage, and this is why I'm doing the things that I'm doing. Not only can American presidents not do that, Americans can't do that, right? The Lakota didn't have homelessness. They just didn't. I'm sorry. The Iroquois Nation didn't have homelessness. The Sioux didn't have homelessness. The Apache, the Pueblo, they didn't have homelessness. And those are the real Americans. When you're talking about coming into a place and displacing not just the people, but the cultures and the customs of this peoples, these are things that we had to learn from them. These are things we could have learned from them. This is what we talk about when we talk about the violence of assuming that the European way of life, the so-called Enlightenment West, has the best vision for what humanity looks like. Because we came into this continent, some of us unwilling, unwanting participants in this experiment. And we destroyed cultures that had solved certain problems. Every now and again, you'll see some person from the mainstream culture go back and try to revisit these concepts. I think about, Walden Pond with Thoreau, right? Like, oh, we should disappear into the woods and we can build our own homes and whatnot. But the reality is, like most spoiled rich white writers, he went home on the weekends. His mom and his sister did his laundry, But it doesn't change the fact that these are possible and doable things. These are things that we could have learned from these cultures that we displaced. And that's the danger of watching indigenous cultures be displaced all around the world, because it assumes that these people have nothing to contribute to humanity. Homelessness is a 100% manufactured phenomenon. It shouldn't be possible for businesses to own places where people live. It shouldn't be possible. It shouldn't be possible for people to have 20 homes when someone has no homes. It shouldn't be possible for there to be people that are homeless and municipalities not enforce some sort of arrangement, pecuniary or otherwise, with these landlord classes that hold these houses as a form of investment. They're speculating. And again, you brought up China. That whole bubble just burst in China right now because the government was very clear. We place people's domiciles and safety and security over profit. And so that whole the Chinese government just let that whole bubble pop, which goes again to why. And that's the whole Evergrande thing. So if you have any questions about that, y'all can look it up. But it goes to why we're at a fundamental crossroads, why the West has to go to war with countries and cultures that still have these kind of ideas that still, for some reason or another, place the needs of the people over the needs of the ownership class. And it's a fundamental thing, right? The fact that capital funds the Democrats, just like big capital funds the Republicans, there's no real incentive anymore to ever stand up, to say, maybe we should make legislation that says the most human person, one human can own is this many houses. Whatever that is, whatever that number is, there would be huge pushback from any Democrat.
And isn't that kind of the crux and the problem with capitalism itself, right? Is that it was absolutely built on enslaved labor, the enslaved labor of Black people, the enslaved labor of Native Indigenous people, and then the indentured servitude of East Asians who came to America and helped build its entire railway. But this is why we also talk about between the three of us and with other folks, the interconnections that even Governor Gavin Newsom moving in this way comes on the heels of the Supreme Court decision saying, hey, you want to make homeless people disappear in whatever ways you need to, we're not going to say anything, that we're going to consider that legal, even though from our perspective, of course, being like, that's inhumane. How dare you not provide the structures in which people don't even become homeless? But why do we have an increasing number of homelessness? The homelessness has been a problem in the United States, practically since the colonizers and settlers visited here. And the reason it's that way is because they want that cheap labor, that you're going to see these homeless encampments disappear. And then nobody asks, well, where are they going? You're not putting them in shelters because there's not enough shelters. You're telling our municipalities that there aren't enough homes, even though there's vacant homes we talk about and see in our city every day, that there's all of these excuses. And the fact is California also has a very large prison labor. They have the highest homeless population. And that these private corporations and private equity firms at the end of the day in the United States not accounting or repairing the damage it's done to so many communities is like, yeah, prison labor is good free slave labor. Of course, those people are bad. Not even defining, like, how are we defining who is bad? Somebody who's homeless, not even by their own choices. It's not a moralistic choice that got them there. That's the American myth. Anybody at any moment in this country can become homeless at the drop of a dime.
Let's also acknowledge that the algorithm has marked some people for extinction. Those people will never be able to get jobs. Those people will not be able to get loans. Those people will not be able to get their names added onto leases, right? And so what's left, right? Just this prison labor thing. I remember years ago, this was so funny, watching the movie Zorro, right? Y'all remember that with Antonio Banderas, and he's representing like this landowning class from Spain, and he's in California, right? And he's talking to the dude, and they're all at the little slave prison thing, and they're all, mining all the gold. And he goes to the dude and goes, where did you find all of these people? And the dude just smirks back, wherever we wanted. Like, we're there. Like, those were the villains of the movie, and we're there. Like, girl boss Kamala Harris went to the Supreme Court to argue that they didn't need to release this amount of prisoners because it was affecting the bottom lines for the prison industrial complex. These are facts.
They're easily searchable facts, yeah.
These are facts.
The average rent since 1990 has tripled in the United States. The salary you need to buy a home has gone up 80% in the last 4 years. You see the inability for the average person to be able to buy a home.
Minimum wage nationally hasn't went up since the 90s.
It had it just, I believe, was it its 15th? Well, whatever it was. I think it was a particular state. But yeah, we haven't seen this go up. So we're now criminalizing people for not having homes, as we're also saying it's now virtually impossible for the average American to buy a home. Not only that, people in other countries don't even understand in the American system, you have something called a credit score. And that credit score impacts so many parts of your life that nothing should be able to impact that way, including leasing a domicile. And you see so often what happens in the United States is, well, how about this? We'll talk about what happens in every major city in the United States, because we're talking about American colonialism and what that looks like around the world. But gentrification is micro-colonialism. And you see that every time gentrification, comes into the topic of conversation, makes people uncomfortable, but it's here. When a condo pops up and 600 people or 600, rooms are there, or 600 apartments or condos are there, it doesn't make sense to sell them all, because you need to inflate those prices. and you need to be able to continue to stay in lockstep with the other condos in those areas, because of course they're all communicating as well. And it's more lucrative to keep the prices high and keep the people that are allowed to be in there, um, low, so you can continue to inflate this. Not only that, we've seen this here in the Washington D.C., where because there is such a demand for affordable housing, these condos are supposed to allow for affordable housing units to be there. And those people were given separate entrances. And, you can't separate race from this, especially here in Washington, D.C. It's such a segregated city. It's such a highly gentrified city. And you'll have an enormous condo, maybe a 24 condo with, spas in there and a Chipotle and CVS. And then you just have huge homeless encampments right outside of it. And this is a normal thing for people who live in a major U.S. city.
It's real Hunger Games shit.
And people are forced to have this sort of, I don't know what to say. I mean, you just have this, how you go through your life and you see people like this everywhere and you hear, conservatives say like silly things, where they're like, oh, this is what happens in democratic cities, even though Florida is the state with the third biggest homeless population in the world. And that's just to remind everyone that it's not a red or blue thing. And these things are coordinated events. I wanted to touch on this as well, because I think Keita mentioned it. The United States has 24% of the world's incarcerated population. We know from the 13th Amendment that, in fact, the enslavement of people is still legal in this country, as long as you have committed a crime. We have literal plantations now in all over the country, where all people, but mainly people of color, and specifically Black people, are now returning to these jobs where they're making 50 cents an hour, and they're working for major corporations, because these corporations are refusing to pay people. They're refusing to, have ethical practices, because the United States has built now this, we call it like, the house of cards that's ready to fall down. And economically, the rest of the world is seeing this. We talk about this all the time on here. The rise of the global majority.
You couldn't even get a modern politician to say that they're a contemporary abolitionist. You can't get a person to say, I am against the enslavement of human beings. Now, of course, they're not going to call them slaves, but if it's forced labor for people that are economically unviable, you've just created a class of people that will be enslaved. And this is what we talk about when we say, especially liberals, they like rhetoric over reality. They don't want to say what it is. They have a prettier way to say it that doesn't, because no one wants to say I'm for slavery. But if you're for forced prison labor, and people can go to prison for any number of reasons, up to and including just being poor, then you're for slavery. You kicked out some stats, and I just want to carry on with that when we talk about what the degradation looks like, right? Because this is not all just vibes, right? We come with facts. So, I wanted to look at, so this is the U.S. manufacturing output, right? For 2022, there was 100% decline from 2021. These stats are according to the ISIC, right? The International Standard of Industrial Classifications. Okay, it looks at the outputs and the inputs, and it calculates deductions and depreciation of fabricated assets, depletion and degradation of natural resources. Okay, so when you're looking at 2020 from 2021, you had 11.5% increase over the year from 2020, right? Then you look at 2019, there was a 5.32% decline in 2019, right? In 2018, from that year, there was a 1.47% increase. I mean, these are not even the standard of living. When it goes up, it barely goes up. When it goes down huge. Now, just to compare, right? Because people say, oh, COVID. These are China's numbers over the same period of time. So for 2022, They had a 1.36% increase from 2021. For 2021 over 2020, they had a 27.15% increase over that year. The manufacturing output for 2020 was a 0.97% increase from 2019. From 2019 to 2018, you get your first decline. It was a 1.16% decline. So when you compare what's happening with the American manufacturing output compared to like the Chinese manufacturing output, it shows we are not keeping pace. I remember in remember that movie RoboCop, right? I'm just giving you because I feel like this culture is a big part of Americana. The whole plot of RoboCop was the cops, which by the way, that movie is a wonderful indictment of fascism and how democratic liberalism always yields to fascism over a long enough time in a capitalist system. The whole thing is the quote unquote good guys who are making the RoboCops and the bad guys who are making the super secret drug just killing everybody. Their stated goal is they want to make America make things again. Because in their opinion, America's economic decline has been destroyed. And it's not a surprise, right? That the whole shit is kind of shot in like New Detroit, you know, because what's a better example of the decline of the American manufacturing power? Looking at how cars were made and how many were made and how good they were in the 90s, as opposed to the amount that are made, how much they cost, and how good they are in 2024.
Also, the shine of American highway systems. Now, of course, I believe strongly in public transportation. I think that is actually what's best for the environment and best for community building. But America had an infrastructure of fast moving highways that could connect you to one end of the country to the other, which is, of course, nobody can even imagine having to drive 30 hours, but it was the shine of it. And today we were making fun of, I think we were driving somewhere, and the three of us were making fun of the fact, like, oh yeah, what's the state you've been in or visited that had the worst roads? And each of us named multiple different states and cities. And so then we can extrapolate from there. It's not an isolated incident to the East Coast because it's dealing with failing infrastructure from New York to even our water pipes, and the fact that even when we found out lead is bad for you, American infrastructure said, well, if you just tell people and then they own it themselves that they're going to live in a house with lead paint or live in a county that has lead pipes that are delivering not clean water to you, that's a responsibility they're taking on themselves rather than pushing back and saying, hey, it's the responsibility of government itself and of these corporations who took all of our tax money to say, hey, we're doing this for the benefit of America. And all we find out is that they gave it to their shareholders and they've been making billions of our tax money and not paying back what they owe to this country for what like we have to deal with. And so we're seeing our roads fail. Truck drivers have been saying it for decades, honestly, because they have to drive these highways and they've been like, y'all, it's getting worse out here. And nobody listened because they're like, oh, truck drivers, you're not that smart, blah, blah, blah. And then the same thing with municipal workers who are like, hey, this trash is getting worse. Hey, we're watching the seep into groundwater, which is our clean drinking water. And the problem with capitalism is it's like, bingo. Here's my chance to open up another revenue stream. It's not clean the water. It's I'm going to sell you clean water.
It's a fact. I think about the bridge that, was destroyed in Baltimore, and they're like, oh, it may take a decade to rebuild. This is a vital arterial connection between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. Also, I mean, it's pretty much along the way. Like if you're trying to go from D.C. to New York, like that's one of the ways that you might go. Right? Now, yeah, a barge hit it. Okay. But even the fact that there wasn't some type of system in place that could regulate that and make that not happen, because deregulation has crippled these systems.
And deregulation is why it happened.
Absolutely. Which again, these are rulings that are happening under a Democratic president. They're going to be way worse under a Republican. But what difference does it make if Democrats prove to be too inept to stop these things? Look, expanding the Supreme Court, this is way more than a Roe v. Wade thing. That is a way to ensure your vision of the future is manufactured and created, right? Why is it the Republicans are able to figure this out and work out a 20-year plan to get exactly what they want? right? And the Democrats every time is, oh, those tricksy Republicans, they've outfoxed us again, right? It's because from a fundamental point of view, these are things that are not inherently antithetical to the Democratic position, right?
And we know because
I just want to say, you don't have to compare this kind of building process to China. Of course, China's going to out-manufacture the United States. They have 1 billion people. But even when you look at a place like Ukraine, that's literally under Russian bombs, they're dropping 3,000 kilogram bombs in Russia, in Ukraine, blowing up bridges, and the Ukrainians will have that bridge back up in a week. They'll have it back up in a month, right? But I gotta hear that in the greatest industrial country in the world, it might take you 10 years to get a vital artery back up. To you, Kita.
Well, and this is this is part of the American mythos, right? That we talk about propaganda works on everybody. And we can see it right here with American citizens, where we're like, look at the material conditions of your life. And even connecting it back to the homelessness population increasing, that because they're not really counted in the census and it's hard to find everybody who's homeless or especially chronically homeless, then they disappear. And a lot of ways, many people disappear into the prison labor system too, that the prison labor system is purported to contribute billions to the US economy. First of all, how messed up is that? That we're like, yeah, free prison labor contributes
slavery
to an economy? Like that is slavery. But
always been predicated on slavery.
Yes. That also, we're not even getting any of the benefits that they're saying we should get. Like, hey, we're making prisoners. Remember, these are murderers and rapists. We're making prisoners do all the dangerous work that you shouldn't have to do because you're a good citizen. And then you dig in and you're like, wait, that man was unfairly incarcerated because he was Black. The police didn't even have the evidence that they needed against him. Wait a second. That person is homeless because they were Native and they happened to leave an enclosed area where they should have the entire freedom of their land, but they're still being oppressed by the American policing system. And here they are into the prison labor system. And then you're like, oh, there's no such thing as a good citizen. And there's no benefit to anybody as citizens of this process because that prison labor is not going into helping any of us, not our infrastructure, not protecting people, and not that anybody should be using prison labor, but that it's all still going into the pockets of these billionaires now becoming trillionaires. And capitalism is working as it should, giving you the illusion like, well, if you be a good citizen, we won't imprison you. We'll make sure you still have a home. And that's a lie. Fact after fact, every group that has been cannibalized. And this is why all of these groups are frustrated. Black people, Native people, East Asian people, Southeast Asian people. Like we're pissed off because we've been cannibalized for this liberal white lie that they still want to believe in about the United States and the American dream.
And it's the half measures of liberalism that lead to the resentments of the conservatives, right? You get this concept of DEI, right? Where you get nominally 10 people out of 100 people, and you make them diverse, right? But only superficially diverse, right? You may look this way, you may come from this ethnicity, right? But ultimately, you still have certain fundamental concepts, right? Like Clint Smith is a Black guy, but he don't think too very different from anyone else at the Atlantic. It's not like they're gonna bring Malcolm X in there, right? But for that 91st white guy that wasn't able to get the job because they're gonna get 90 of them, and then that 10% is gonna be women, queer people, Muslims, Black people, indigenous, right? You're like, oh my God, the reason I can't make it in this life is because I got blocked from this job, right? And it's like, it's so like these things are not challenged on any type of level. By having these half measures that liberalism invents, it creates the resentments because in nowhere is it explained, well, here's the thing, wealth inherits. So, you are having some inherent fundamental advantages in your position, not specifically because you are white, but absolutely specifically because your great granddad was, and he was able to do things that only white men could do back then. And it gave him some advantages. and he was able to pass those advantages on to your dad, and your dad was able to pass those on to you. So yeah, you yourself did not exploit those things, but you're exploiting those things that exist now because wealth inherits. So you need a little bit less help. For every time we talk about DEI, but we don't talk about legacy, right? Maybe the reason you didn't get in is because George Bush, with his C average, took up your spot at Yale. Maybe it wasn't the black person that came from the hood that got a 1600 on their SATs and a scholarship. Maybe it wasn't that person, but maybe it was.
I want to bring this up because we've heard things in the United States. Our president now, Joe Biden, has said he's the most pro-union president of all time.
That's just beyond a gaslight. It's a lie. I mean, we had I'm so sorry. I'm so passionate about this, and I have to speak on it. Right when he's going to the UAW and he's breaking up those strikes, when he's going to the train people at Union Pacific, and he's saying Christmas is more important than your strike, Jack. And people died because these trains were unsafe, and they're striking for literal safety, and people are dying, and chemicals are going into the water systems. Like again, it goes to why the people that are down home conservative people, they're like, all Democrats do is lie, because they see that. They're the ones that have to deal with the fact that all of these chemicals spilled into their waters, and now the place that they fished at for 70 years, now the fish is poisoned.
And for me, which unions? Which unions have said President Biden's the best? Because is it the police union? Yeah, I bet they would say that he's been the best union president.
They endorsed Trump, by the way. They did.
No, I believe it, but I always ask which unions. And, of course, there's going to be some unions who are going to say, like, oh, Biden did some backroom deals with us to try to improve our safety. But largely, his public face has been anti-union. What is he saying in front of the cameras? What is he saying to the press? What is he saying to some of those unions? Why is it always off screen? You can help them, but I don't see the material conditions improve.
Yeah, it's like he's tough talking Netanyahu behind the scenes.
Right. I mean, Tanky's right. So we were talking about the train unions. Did we see tracks improve? Did we see fewer
Europe's got high-speed rail. China's got high-speed rail. South Korea's got high-speed rail. Japan has high-speed rail.
I think that this is what
Tesla coming in and doing it, but that's private. That's not the government stepping in to do something that is vital for the continued infrastructure of the United States of America to make sure that people, goods, and technology can get from New York to LA in the minimal amount of time, because all of this is part of your country.
We've seen some of the biggest we've seen some of the biggest unions form within these last 8 years. We've seen some of the biggest strikes and union protests happen at this time. And of course, Biden and the Democrats want to say, like, we were there, we were on the picket line. But we've seen this before, right? We've seen this with Biden pretending that he walked with Martin Luther King. We see it with a bunch of politicians pretending, well, I would have protected little girl Ruby. I wouldn't have let those people throw stones at her. And I'm like, but your family was literally there. We have the historical photos. You can't rewrite some of this history that y'all.
It was Sanders who pretended to walk with King. Biden was an out and out segregationist. Just, for the record.
Didn't want his kids going to a racial jungle.
They're going to fact check that and say, well, you don't have the context. Explain to me the context.
Right. And how that carries into policies right now. We talk about United States infrastructure. The education system has been entirely gutted by policy after policy that actually does not want Americans to be smarter. Because once Americans become smarter and we look at the historical records of what's happened, we want to see something. We want to see a better future, and then we will figure our ways around it. And like the education system also for an industrialized country lags far behind other global industrialized countries, math, science, and literacy. And that history, the United States pretends to be so great.
There's too much focus group. And it's so funny because it comes from the facts don't care about your feelings crowd. But then when we start talking about how,
critical race theory, they're like, throw them books out.
right? Like the largest slaughter of Native Americans by any one president ever was Abraham Lincoln. Well, he was a great emancipator. He murdered indigenous people left and right. He hung them. He started wars on Native indigenous late nations, like and even with the Civil War, in the Emancipation Proclamation was a punishment for the South. That was not the initial goal. Like, well, again, right? And it goes to what you're saying. Like American history, it goes back to literally full circle. Putin giving lectures about Russian history to Tucker Carlson because he's able to do those things because he understands that. Not in a sensational firecracker on the boys, rah-rah reimagination of what American history was, but literally this was the history. And Catherine the Great went into this province, blah. Like, let's not act like it's just Trump that couldn't do that. Kamala couldn't do that. Biden certainly couldn't do that. They don't know these things, but they have focus groups and all of this education just to make sure there's never any progress that happens too much because they're terrified of progress on every single level. And so your culture.
Well, no, take it because you've talked about this. It's not even like they don't want to see progress, but that they are actively pulling us backwards. Actively. That, when we think about inflation, that we can't say minimum wage has gone up at all, that it's regressed. Tanky said this in a conversation that we were having about minimum wage, inflation, and yet we're still getting New York Times and Wall Street Journal saying how great the economy is because unemployment is low. But I'm also reading about mass layoffs in Silicon Valley, mass layoffs in manufacturing.
Well, if you work mass layoffs 6 hours on Uber Eats, right. That's a job.
It is the government's job, again, and this is maybe just because I'm a flaming communist, to tie the population's minimum wages at least to the rate of inflation. Because the little man has zero to do with inflation. That is government policy. And so any government policy that increases inflation without a reflex in real wages, you are purposely, again, working to take assets and economic viability away from
we literally
your free class.
We have terms now called the working homeless.
Right.
That's not what a society should have. I wanted to read this too because y'all were both mentioning the East Palestine oil chemical spill, right? And this was a huge deal. It's still affecting that area. It wasn't the only spill that year.
It was several.
Yeah. Norfolk Southern, that was the company that was running those trains. The CEO got a 37% raise in June. And I want to just ask both of y'all this. We talk about this all the time, and you've mentioned it a little bit, Tanky. This idea of especially the most privileged people in the world in this country always seem to fall upwards, no matter what they do, no matter how incompetent, no matter how unqualified they are for a position. And we talked about this too, Keita, when one of our other friends was talking about, they had to get one of their other employees fired. And a month later, another branch of that organization had rehired them or tried to rehire them. It's simply because, it's the same people that enter through these systems because you don't want contrarians. We watched this when we were watching
Mad Men.
Mad Men, right.
But the reality is, if I had one felony, I probably couldn't work at a department store or any technology store.
Yeah, no, I mean, when you're a felon, it's an incredibly first of all, there are still places in the United States where if you are a felon and you have already left the prison system, you're still not allowed to vote.
You're not allowed to vote. You can't own guns.
No, and you mentioned you're a felon. You're not allowed to get student loan service from the government.
We have a felon that's about to become the president. And I don't say that to ostracize felons. I really don't. I'm just saying.
Law is not morality. It's not ethics. And I think everyone here knows that.
But also, we created this, that the moment we see things are going wrong and we don't endeavor to do our best to correct it, like that is a flaw in our economy, in US election, in US politics, and in many ways, US morality, even though it tries to say, like Israel, it's the most moral country in the world. And
That's
yet
just a
you've
slogan.
committed so many
Rhetoric over
atrocities
reality.
you refuse to even own up to. Today, we have to tell white kids, slavery was just a job opportunity for Black people. With Get out of here. Your grandparents and ancestors enslaved other people because they were pieces of shit.
And tried to kill them if they left.
This
Would
is why
whip
they're
them until they were permanently disfigured if they left. Might debilitate them by chopping off an arm or a leg if they left. Let's stop acting like slavery was this benevolent thing. Oh, the Romans had slaves. Even the Romans weren't barbarous like this. American shadow slavery is something unlike anything the world has ever seen. There's nothing that's comparable to it.
not to mention, like the the system itself still uses its full force to marginalize Black people. It's not something that, like Jim Crow laws. Now we have mass incarceration and the forcing out of people from the workforce, Black people from the workforce. I wanted to mention this too because we talked about it and we've danced around the police here. We had last week, or I don't even know if it was last week, um, Sonia Massey, who had called the police and was afraid that someone had entered her home and wanted to feel safe and called the police. She was boiling a pot of water. The police officer who was there, who had already several write-ups and citations, shot and killed her. We see that
and said that she did it herself.
and later on the radio they said that it was a suicide. And we see that every year since the United States has been keeping the record of people being killed by the police, we've seen those numbers go up every year. Not to mention, we had a great podcast many years ago about how they're vastly underreported. We also had, I believe it was in Jackson, in where, correct me if I'm wrong, but there was 200 bodies buried behind the prison, or what was the police station. I wasn't sure. We still have this idea now that a person who's a former DA, is now the Democrats' pick, and we had the biggest Zoom call in history.
A person whose entire career was predicated off capturing and enslaving people that were seen as out of spec. You smoked a little weed, or you were something out of the mainstream.
Yeah, I mean, not to mention, we often see all these white collar criminals get slaps on the wrist and things like that are always tending to happen. I mean, we just, again, it's not just an issue here in the United States. It's just one of the most prevalent and best examples of police violence is here in the United States. Don't think that there is any reason to believe that the vile nature of the IDF and what they've done has not been also furthered and by the United States' ideology. And of course, obviously, their helping of weapons and intel and things of that nature. The police system and the policing of the world has left the United States budget and their economy basically tied to the domestic military, which is the police force here, as well as the military outside. And we see that in of itself is bringing to this crumbling of the United States, what I like to call the nothing. If you remember, I was growing up in the in the the late 80s, early 90s, and there was a movie called The Never Ending Story. And in this story, there's something called the nothing, and the nothing just eats everything.
Yeah.
And we see this
very
and we witness
intensive
this.
childhood moment.
And it, helped to radicalize me, or at least, create a metaphor like here. But anyway, I wanted to mention that because, we are here in, Washington, D.C., and there's certain areas where you go where you don't see a cop, and there's certain areas you go where there's a cop on every block. I just wanted y'all to speak to that if you got any thoughts.
It's undeniable we actually see more police presence, and I don't think that's isolated to D.C. I can only speak for myself and my travels, but I see cops in way more prevalence, way more places, and also new jobs that embody the appearance of safety that cops are supposed to provide. That we see
Loss
a lot more
prevention.
security guard. Yeah, loss prevention. We keep inventing new words for cop, but at the end of the day, it's a cop. And
And
yeah, that I mean, we're seeing their increased presence though because the imperial boomerang. I mean, you talked about it that cops have been going to Israel because they're seeing domestic unrest because United States infrastructure is failing and people are protesting, and the only thing that this country knows how to do is oppress. At the end of the day, is to lean into new human depravities.
and
And
that's
so
a
the
real
police
thing.
force is absolutely supposed to kettle us in, supposed to keep us calm. You should love this country. This country's great. It's not doing anything. And yet everything that you're doing to other people, cops have done here.
To your point, DeMuscle, the thing about it is the place I'm most likely to see a law enforcement officer these days is at the grocery store. Now, why are these people armed with lethal implement? You gonna shoot somebody in the back because they, stole a pack of Wonder Bread, or you think they did? Like the fact that there are law enforcement officers with lethal, and by the way, that's in the hood, right? One of the things about DC was in the 80s there was this huge pollution thing. So there was a law on the books where to get some of the plastic out of the Anacostia River, you should bring your own groceries. Now, this was a great thing from an environmental point of view. I feel like it was one of the great wins. And the Anacostia River has responded over the past decade. It's a lot more habitable. The fish are coming back, right? But when you bring your bags into the grocery stores in the hood, literally people will follow you around and say, you can't do that. When I'm in Georgetown, ain't no problem with it. So you know what I'm saying? Why aren't there people with murder death sticks when I go to the grocery store in Georgetown, right? But there are when I go, in the hood in Southeast. Like, is it worth killing someone, potentially killing someone? Even if you have to have law enforcement there and you want to arrest someone, right? Why are they armed with lethal implementations? The kind of person that steals food is so destitute and poor.
No
Nobody's going
threat to
in
you.
there, right, to steal $7,000 worth of
But
steaks. That's just
also,
not
they
reality.
are not judges or executioners. Your job is to detain. Why do you have lethal
Apprehend.
weapons at all? Like,
Absolutely.
why?
I'm seeing
And like you
here.
said, we see them at the grocery store, that we see them at the airport. We see them haranguing people. Like, gosh, with Netanyahu coming to DC opted to lease, hire, whatever you want to contract with, I think, 20,000 New York police officers that they brought into the city and said, we know things are going to get crazy. And how did things get crazy? The police brought the craziness.
Yeah, and we know that there are always bad faith actors within those crowds, and it happens all the time. You see random people always staring or wandering around with an Israeli flag, just sort of to ready to pop off something or make something incendiary. I wanted to mention this. This is just some more breaking news because again, I just like Tanky said, we're here for the facts. We're here for the receipts. You can take everything that we say and do your own research. I am not here to tell anybody how to think. I'm just telling you what the facts are. LAPD offering new hires $24,000 rent subsidy to boost recruitment in an area in a state now where homelessness is illegal. So do we not see that there is a direct correlation between the prices and the spending of the police in contrast to what happens when you're supposed to do when there is civil unrest, which is listen to your people, listen to what's happening, and act accordingly. But that doesn't happen here in the United States because we are here for one thing and one thing only: the the thoughts and ideas, the ideologies, and the hawks that exist within the quote unquote deep state or whatever you want to call it, the U.S. apparatus, the political apparatus, the military apparatus that takes a significant portion of all of the money that the United States makes. Every single year, don't have a whole lot of argument or debate on how much money is going to go to the police or how much money is going to go to the military. Now, maybe you may have some political posturing around money sent to Ukraine. But again, that war is just going to be defunded so we can fund another one. And you've already heard many people surrounding the Trump administration talk about a pivot to China or Iran. So it seems as if
it looks like Iran is next on the table. I gotta say, so like this whole latest attack in the Golan, right, which according to the United Nations belongs to Syria, but it's occupied by Israel. But it's not Israelis that live there, right? It's really this Arab Druze kind of minority. They're not quite Muslim. They're not quite Jewish. They're kind of Christian. They're the ones that live there, right? And so you're hearing about this attack that happened on a soccer field. And the reality is, most of the reports that I'm seeing shows that, once again, this was almost like what happened on the beach in Crimea. There was a missile fired, and then missile defense was fired by the Iron Dome, and the intercepted missiles fell down onto the soccer field, and that's what caused the casualties. But this is being used as the casus belli to initiate the war in Lebanon. So it feels to me like that war is smoked up and ready to go, which is another reason why they're asking for this Ukrainian stuff to get wrapped up as fast as possible. Because again, they don't have the industrial output to feed Israel with the intensity that Israel's going to need to be fed.
Exactly. It's you're not the whole thing about the conservative, like everyone is anti-war until they're in office, and then it's like, okay, well, now that we have the stick, it's ready to go. I want to just bring it back real quick to this because I think it was important. DC has a Black woman Democrat mayor and a Black woman police chief who is an ordained Baptist minister. Let me know when you want to discuss the limits and false hope of representation or inclusion at the head of violent system. That's from Dana White, another Dana White from UFC, but another Dana White, DC owned, DC based.
He would die if he said it.
Yeah, and I think it just kind of goes back to this point that there are like two really indoctrinated aspects of each of these sides, right? The Republicans have this idea of like DEI and it's woke and the border, even though communism and leftists and LGBTQI, blah, 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 and they don't know, and they're just so indoctrinated, and it's so easy for the people on the blue side to be able to go, oh my God, look how indoctrinated they are. But look at the things that you're indoctrinated by. You believe that someone, just because someone has a different background or this is what we're talking about, the false diversity of someone like Kamala Harris, who parents basically disowned her. Hey, we don't approve of your cozying up to imperialism and white supremacy, and again, representation is not going to be the way that we're going to win, but also diversity is a must. And and we talked about this too earlier with the colleges, where they were essentially, the affirmative action bill or whatever they call it, was taken down. Colleges don't have to do that anymore. But we see that the quote unquote diversity hires or the things that they're affirmative action to are the people who are sons and daughters and granddaughters of people who have already went to those schools and are let in based on legacy. And we don't hear about that. And it seems like there's always this disconnect because there are two brands of propaganda directed toward one side and the other. And us as leftists and socialists and communists or whatever you want to call us, again, we're just here for the people. We think that people should have services. We're just faced with these realities and dealing with very simple discussions that we really could have. Hey, here's why Kamala is not going to work. Here's why Donnie J, obviously, I probably don't have to have those conversations, at least with our current friend group.
It's just a lack of complexity in the mind of the American voter, right? Think about voting as a process, right? Say you go to Burger King and you mess up your Whopper. You have to have a way of punishing them, right? You stop going there or you go somewhere else. You don't keep buying that Whopper because it's like, well, if I don't buy this Whopper, all of the Big Macs will win. Like, that's not grown up thinking, right? When the Republicans do what they when the Republican, there's no way to punish your Democrats. When you vote for the Democrats to do this thing and they don't do this thing, what do? You're not going to vote Republican. It's not like you're going to punish them with that. You reward them with and that's called moral hazard. It's a literal phenomenon. It's a phenomenon where at one point you just get to a point where there's no real reason, no real incentive for them to ever make good on their promises. Because what are you going to do? You're not going to not vote for them. But you should have some way of punishing, right? As a consumer, they are offering you a product. You are claiming to have these values, right? When they fail to reaffirm Roe v. Wade, you don't reward them by voting for them again. You punish them. Like, that level of thinking, it never takes place in the American imagination. It's intellectual gangs. I'm a Republican. I'm a Democrat. But why? Are you a politician?
Well, yeah, and that's the danger of identity politics, because if you are a thing and you are inherently good, then all the decisions you make are good, inherently good. And it's a flawed argument anyway, regardless. But Tanky, you touched on it, that it's a lack of imagination. And even that lack of imagination extends to thinking the voting is the only way to make change, especially when you know historically that, and this is something that they still talk about in the United States education system. And so there's very little reason people shouldn't make that connection. But if you know voting was denied to huge subsets of the population, and yet you see voting as the only means of making change, then like your imagination is flawed right then and there. That it was protesting, that it was a creativity of the human imagination to say, we're not going to buy here. We're going to build our communities here. We're going to only do business with our communities if the American system itself is going to exclude us and in many ways impoverish us so that we're beholden to this system. If this system won't help us, then we're going to do other things. And then decided that, okay, maybe one strategy is we should learn how to vote. But and I say that because most people, even now, especially when Kamala came forward as a potential presidential nominee, people automatically switched and were like, oh, she's just great. She's amazing. And there's nothing wrong. And we have to do this system. And I'm like, at the end of the day, you can't tell people that you've disenfranchised to vote for your candidate who's going to continue to disenfranchise them. And that voting is in the way because those same people should be figuring out, how do we expand the vote? How do we break out of a two-party system? Because it's inherently flawed and inherently damaging to the average American citizen. It's not somebody who's making like $100,000 a year or like $500,000 a year. It's the person who's like, I'm begging for just like $12 minimum wage. That's what I want. And maybe to go to the doctor.
And it goes back to the weaponization of identity. These are the things that the Democrats have not learned They haven't learned one thing. They tried to bully everyone in America for liking their candidate in 2016, who was a very flawed candidate, who had huge demerits that appealed to a small percentage of the population, but the percentage that didn't like her were irretractable and unmovable. But this identity, it was their turn. And here are the Democrats again, right? You can see already they're making the same identity pitch. Like, you have to vote for this person or you hate Black people, right? Never mind the fact that we won't begin to discuss what is a true Black identity for a Jamaican Indian, right? Who lives in America. You have to vote for this person because they're a woman or you hate, like.
Mind you, there's two women candidates I think are far better.
There
Claudia
are
and Karina and Jill Stein.
Candidates. Well, yeah, right. The entire
I just feel like
ticket is feminine, right? Is woman presenting. The Green Party candidate is a woman, and now the Democrats, presumably, because I don't believe nothing until I see it certified at the convention.
Okay, but she's still part of an administration that's committing multiple genocides across the globe, and I can't ever.
You haven't interrogated any of their actual policies. You just
her only
policy
is "I'm not Trump." Like, that's literally all I hear from her commercials, from her speeches.
Not Trump.
I'm not Trump, and I'm like, okay, How about the border? Are you going to open up the borders and stop criminalizing and hosting internment camps at the border? Are you
I'm
going
not
to
Trump.
invest in American infrastructure and get everybody in this country clean drinking water? Are
I'm not
you
Trump.
going to commit to change, like climate change? We're seeing extreme heat that is passing human survivability. What are you going to do to cap maximum? Like, we need wage caps at this rate. People should not be making trillions of dollars and thereby increasing the minimum wage, because there really should be a lot higher. What are you doing to improve housing for all of these millions of homeless people? I'm not Trump.
I'm not Trump.
And I have to vote for her because Trump is worse. And under Kamala Harris and the Biden administration, we're already getting police indiscriminately murdering people across the street, police snatching up protesters who we don't know what happened to them. They vanished into the freaking prison system, that we don't have clean drinking water, that we don't have really good food products anymore because everything has salmonella and bacterial infections. I get a food warning almost every day being like, hey, this has been recalled because this disease and this. And then speaking of diseases, COVID is still running rampant through our communities. That's happening right now before we even get to the polls in November. But I have to be afraid of Trump, and I'm already dealing with the existential crisis of living as an American citizen.
Yeah, not even understanding that that's not always a winning topic, right? Trump gave stimmies. Trump is a horrible, 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 horrible human being. But Trump cut stimmies. Stimmies didn't even cut stimmies. They stopped the stimmies.
I want to just get in. This will be the last thing I ask before we, whatever. I don't know. We wrapping. I just wanted to mention this. I don't have to remind y'all, but I do want to remind the people that Boeing just kills people. That's just what they do.
People die. Let's use a passive construction.
As you, they had
snitch on Boeing, get unalived.
Yeah, I mean, and in a lot of ways, they kind of already said that they did. I mean, there are a lot of innuendo in the current the form. There was a hearing a few weeks ago where he, again, the Boeing CEO made $32.8 million this year for a company that has, and I think is a great example of how the United States, I don't want to say the United States, but really even the Western world, but the United States is the most prevalent, the way that money is made here. And that is Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4 earnings. It doesn't matter what your long-term viability in the market is, because no one has long-term viability unless they are subsidized by the government, which most corporations are. So you have an organization like Boeing, who is one of the biggest companies in the world, that for many years there was not a lot of conversation surrounding the safety of airplanes and things like that, because airplanes were making money, companies were making money. There was no reason to skimp out on security or manpower or safety, because you were making money hand over fist. But now we see that Q1 earnings have to be maximized. So instead of using a proper lubricant for a door, you just go ahead and use Ajax, or Dawn. Sorry, not Ajax, Dawn, the good stuff. Yeah, they went with the good stuff and got the Dawn liquid, the soap, which is obviously not something that I want. Now, if I was like somewhere in the desert and I need to get a plane started and it worked in a pinch, great, but not a multi-billion-dollar corporation. And we see this happening. The financial sector is Q1, Q2, Q3 earnings, push up our stocks, stock buybacks, and they don't use that money that they're making tons, billions, even DeMus was saying trillions of dollars. We don't see that being reinvested back into the people. So we have this system where all the money does is funnel up as fast as humanly possible. And as long as you can say, hey, people have jobs, because again, if you drive Uber Eats for 6 hours, you got a job. We can say things like, oh, the stock market is doing really well, even though there's over 1 million homeless people. They just change the way that the numbers work. And Boeing is a corporation that will probably face very little consequences That was the thing for me. I just wanted to see if y'all wanted to respond to that or any thoughts in general.
All I'll say about this is those are the companies that are making so much government profit. It's actually shocking to me because what they do is so important to the perceived standing of the state. You make the weapons of war, the most expensive, you know. I mean, there's overrun after overrun, right? And it's hard to hear about how you're having all of these overruns when your profitability is higher than it's ever been. So you have planes that cost $2 billion a pop, and then you come to find out the standards of their manufacture are questionable. You have United States congressmen calling them billion-dollar paperweights, and yet American foreign policy is so hawkish, right? You don't know when you're going to need these things and what they'll actually be like in a theater of war. Like, these are the other reasons why really all of these politicians should be pumping the brakes. Like, you're not even in a place to truly assess what your strength is as far as a lot of these assets go because you don't know how reliable they really are.
That's the great joke to capitalism to me. And I think like that's a great joke of in many ways, the deep state moves in ways that we can't always articulate, but that the structures and the clamps that it puts on everything, at the end of the day, America is loyal to nothing but the dollar. And if it's only loyal to the dollar, then why does it care about building great products? Why does it care about standards? That, of course, we're going to see all of that get cannibalized. That's part of the failing of the US infrastructure is that we privatize things that should have stayed public. We privatized electric grids. Why did we do that? We privatized water. Why did we do that? It should be a public good. And so that's what, and I mean, the globe is not stupid either, because like, this is how we know propaganda works. It works on politicians who are like, but America is great. We're the best country in the world. And it's like, you fool, you absolute noob. No, it's not, because of course Boeing doesn't have any loyalty to standards because you gave them billions anyway. They've blown up so many planes. They've killed so many countless people. And the United States said,
People have
here's
been
a
killed.
fine. Here's a fine. No, because look, every person who has been murdered in a plane crash built by a Boeing professional is a person that they have murdered. That absolutely, these corporations are murdering people,
or at least manslaughter.
Okay,
whether
that, yeah, and Boeing is not isolated. Yes, it absolutely
I think that's
is
what we're
on
getting at.
them.
Ultimately,
yeah,
it's on the company to take responsibility for that.
And we should hold them accountable to it. And we didn't. And then we're wondering why planes are falling out of the sky. We're wondering why Navy ships don't have fire extinguishers. We're wondering why these missiles aren't working. Like, why is our tactical computer not working? It's built off AI. It's supposed to be the best. It's like, there's nothing the best about a country that only cares about making the most money for one individual as possible.
And there it is.
Yeah. This was a great podcast, great episode.
I just want to say this in closing. This is something you and I were talking about in passing the other day, because it goes back to the fact that we have people with guns in grocery stores where people are trying to get food. But once again, America had the ultimate renewable food source. Millions of bison migrating through the Great Plains that cost no one anything. Anyone could have went and hunted a bison for food. So long as these things would have happened in a reasonable way, there's no reason why any American should have ever been hungry. There was a renewable food source, and it was just wiped out because the Native Americans eat these. We can't break their backs so long as this food source exists. And now regular Americans continue to suffer to this day. That's the short-sighted mind state of the West. And it makes all of these problems inevitable.
To this day. Innercityleft.com. I want to give a big shout out to the podcast listeners. Hit us up on Patreon, patreon.com/innercityleft. My laptop is acting, as the kids say, brand new, and not in the good way. So I can't pull up. Oh, you know what? I'm just full of lies. Thank God I'm beautiful. Okay, I want to give a big shout out to our Patreon members: Dubsy22, Nicole Hedges, Jay Goulart94, No Ground, Robbie, Paula, Lissa, Lauren, Suzette, and Dennis. We really appreciate everybody's contribution. You can always also support us by streaming or purchasing me or Lil Tanky's music. Unfortunately, I don't know if I'm gonna be able to put links in the description anymore. We're gonna see how that works out.
YouTube be hating, y'all already know. So y'all got to do even more.
You know the two most ridiculous words: community guidelines.
Who's community? Who's guy? I ain't get to say. Sounds like
On the real, connect with your neighbors.
Once again, liberal ideas. I couldn't get to play Mortal Kombat as a kid because a Democrat, okay, didn't want me to do it. Too much blood and gore. I couldn't listen to Nirvana and Tupac as a kid because Tipper Gore was offended. These Democrats, man.
It goes to the idea of like, oh, we don't condone violence, or we don't. It's like you're backing a G side.
The military.
Just silly. For Emoji Lil Tanky Sumler, The Muscle, I'm a Mean TMK. For Inner City Left, peace.
Deuces.
System riding to the core. Yeah. Reppin' Inner City Left.